That Newcastle game in particular just felt like there was just this pure rage from the frustration of the previous season and then being embarrassed in the Charity Shield. It felt like it was all unleashed on Manchester United in those nights.
And also, Biker Grove had gone shit by this point, so they really needed something to be happy about.
a pick me up for the region, absolutely.
Yeah, PG had gone blind by this point, I think, hadn't he?
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to When Football Began Again, the podcast that takes a nostalgic look at the Premier League era. Today's show is a deep dive back into the archives to 1996-97 for our season review feature. I have Damien St John and Rob Fletcher joining me on the show for a Chelsea and Middlesbrough perspective, two major players of this season, as well as the whole season covered. It's a really interesting chat, lots of nostalgia covered, more on that in a moment. Before we get to that, just a word on some of the previous week's episodes. I ended last week's show on Bradford City by hoping that Premier League legend Mark Hughes would last a little bit longer at Bradford City. He has since been sacked. The curse of the podcast continues. But thank you for all of the lovely messages and response generally to that Bradford episode, especially from Bradford City fans. It seems Wayne Jacobs is such a club legend there and a lovely, lovely guy that really comes across on the episode. So do give that a listen if you haven't done yet. Also, the guest from the previous week, Raul Coley, who spoke so passionately about what the Champions League football meant to Newcastle United. What a week he had. Having been to Milan the previous couple of weeks ago, he was at St James's for the 4-1 win over PSG, and his Instagram stories really were something to behold. So great news for two of my former guests, and also for Neil Cox, who was on the week before. His York City side very unlucky this weekend to concede a late equaliser to Bromley, but their march up the National League table away from the relegation zone continues. Neil Cox in assistant manager there to Neil Ardley and going great guns. But let's get on to this week's episode and this week's guests. Rob Fletcher has been on the show before. He's a massive Middlesbrough fan. He's wrote a brilliant book and is writing another one. More on that in the episode. And Damien St John, who's a podcaster in his own right, a comedian, a Chelsea fan, lovely guy as well. We really had an enjoyable dip back into the archives. It is a bit swearier, this one, than some previous episodes, but not as sweary as Premier Passions. So here goes 1996-97 with Rob and Damien. Enjoy. Joining me today to discuss the 1996-97 season are two fantastic guests, one a returner and one making his debut. Let's start with our debutant. It's comedian, author and Chelsea fan, Damien St John. Damien, how you doing, mate?
Lovely, thanks, Carl. Yourself?
I'm very good, thank you. After small technical issues, recording today's show that you've both been very patient with, we are now good to go. Looking forward to reliving 96-97 with you. And making his return, it's another author and Middlesbrough fan. It's Rob Fletcher. Rob, welcome back to the show. How are you doing, mate? You okay?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Yeah, thanks. Didn't realise there was going to be a Chelsea fan to rub it in on the show, but I'm sure I'll get over that.
Exactly. I mean, Chelsea and Middlesbrough, two of our major players for different reasons in 96-97, as we will soon discover. Before we do that, Rob, let's start with you. We already covered your Middlesbrough origin story when you were first on the show. So have you ever seen a footballer out in the wild?
So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about, who I've seen locally in Middlesbrough when you've been in bars and things like that. But one of the ones I thought of, and it's kind of a bit of a name drop, and it is kind of meant to be, I suppose. But when I was writing my first book, I was desperately trying to get input from players and managers and coaches. And as you do, you message everybody on Instagram and Twitter, and you try and email all these random faceless speaker@management.com, and no one ever gets back to you. And then one day I got an email and it was like, would you like to translate this from German? And it was Andreas Bremer, the World Cup winner from Italia 90. So although not quite in the wild, I suppose it was a little bit of a random football encounter. So of all the people that are in there, but 1990 World Cup winner was one of them. So, yeah.
I think that definitely qualifies. Damien, what about you? Tell us about your Chelsea origin story. When did you discover they were the team for you?
Right, but can I also just say Trevor Sinclair, Marks and Spencer's Harrow, 1996. Because he was playing for QPR and his girlfriend lived in Harrow and he had the dreadlocks, and I was like, that is Trevor Sinclair. Just saying. When did it all start with Chelsea? 1st of December 1984. I was 5. The game was Chelsea versus Liverpool. Chelsea were back in the top division after 5 seasons in Division 2. That's right, kids. We used to be bad. And we used to be like 2nd division bad. Liverpool, as you know, in the 80s were doing very well. My grandparents, my granddad and his sister, so they're Irish immigrants. My granddad moved over here in the 40s. He moved around quite a lot actually in the 40s and that in the 50s, like West Bromwich, all the kind of worker places where there was kind of like manual labour was on the rise. And he settled in sort of Irish northwest London. Ended up going to Chelsea quite a lot, and he took me to my first match, and we won. So I always expect to beat Liverpool by that score, 3-1.
Well, first off, let's go back to August 1996. Let's stick with you for a minute then, Damien. What do we need to know about you as the season's kicking off in 1996?
Well, I was busy, like, still starstruck after seeing Trevor Sinclair at the M&S in Harrow. Which was a real moment. August 1996 was the summer of my first breakup, so I'm really glad you picked me for this. I'd been busy having left high school, becoming a man, which means fingering a lot. And I don't know what you'll do when you edit this podcast, but yeah, I was riding high on a crest of a wave, and it didn't last. 1 year, 10 months, 9 days. You never forget. And so I kind of went back to college the second year trying to work out who I was again. And I think when you're busy, you kind of the first partner, you might drift off from your friends and your family a little bit, and you're just enjoying yourself. So yeah, it was a chance to kind of come back to the home and sit on the sofa watching Premier League football with my parents, and it brought back a lot of memories. Most of them good.
And pre-Watershed. Rob, I'd love. I mean, it's up to you as to how much detail you want to go into.
Well, I was decidedly pre-Watershed in 1996. I was leaving primary school actually, so my summer was basically spent around pretending to be England footballers on the field during Euro '96, as you do. It was the first year after we'd been in the Premier League in sort of my era, really. I kind of missed the first one. We didn't have a season ticket, so we'd been to see some games, but that year we were going to have our first season ticket, myself and my dad. So we'd sort of got all that ready, and then we signed Emerson and we signed Ravanelli. So it was it felt quite exotic. I was very much playing Championship Manager, like the Spanish, Dutch and Belgian leagues or whatever were kind of on the game attachment or whatever you could get. So it was kind of like getting ready for a first proper season of like being a fan. I'd watched footy before, like from USA '94, really, but this was like the birth of the fan, if you like.
I can relate to that. Definitely a lot of excitement going into this season. Post Euro '96, of course, as well, which we will cover. So let's begin our review of 96-97 with a review of the title race. We'll cover a few of the runners and riders before we get to the main players. Sheffield Wednesday topped the table after 3 games with a 100% record on their way to a 7th placed finish. Wimbledon lose their first 3 games of the season, but follow that with a 7-game winning streak and are actually in 2nd place as late as mid-December before falling away. Chelsea and Aston Villa are mainstays in the top 6 without ever really mounting a serious challenge. Double winners Manchester United set a marker down in their 4-0 Charity Shield victory over rivals Newcastle in a debut to forget for world record signing Alan Shearer. David Beckham is also on the score sheet in that match, but he's on opening day at Selhurst Park where he really announces himself, beating Neil Sullivan from the halfway line in a 3-0 win. Alongside the Uniteds of Manchester and Newcastle are Liverpool and Arsenal under new boss Arsene Wenger after a couple of months in what will be a 4-way tussle for the most part this season. Rob, Ian Wright responds with a jokey who to the cameras when asked about his new manager joining. What do you remember about Wenger's appointment? Had you never heard of him either, or were you following the J-League religiously on Transworld Sport?
Well, I was definitely watching Transworld Sport, but I definitely don't remember anything about Arsene Wenger. It was one of those things when you're a Premier League fan or a fan of English football. We had Gazzetta Football Italia. We had Football Italia on a Sunday, so you kind of knew a little bit about another league. But something like the J League was kind of where Gary Lineker got a bit of a gammy toe and had to retire. It wasn't like a league that you really understood, and especially 10, 11-year-old. I didn't really know what it was, where it was, who was there. And it was a little bit like, why do we need to go to another country, firstly, to get managers? Like, where are the English managers? And then secondly, why are Arsenal getting a French manager? And why does his name sound a bit like Arsenal? Like when you're a kid and you're like, oh, they've got Arsenal Wenger. You think, oh, yeah, that's a good fit for him. But I think I remember at the time, he just looked very different. Like, he didn't look like your sort of permatanned Ron Atkinson or like the gruff sort of school teacher Alex Ferguson. He just looked a little bit different. And I think when you start hearing stuff in like Shoot magazine or Match or 90 Minutes or whatever, there was quite a lot of a mocking tone around the whole appointment. So Bruce Rioch obviously used to manage Middlesbrough and sort of brought us back from the brink, really. So it felt like quite a big shift from, I suppose, someone you'd heard of, as in Rioch, but was a bit of a random Arsenal manager, I feel like, in their history, to someone who kind of felt quite unknown, even for someone who kind of wasn't really that well-versed in sort of foreign managers.
Yeah, but largely unknown to the English game, as we'll cover. I mean, by mid-October, Newcastle are leading the table going into the weekend of the visit of Manchester United in a game that will rock St James's Park to its foundations. A 5-0 win for Newcastle leads Alan Shearer to say, we were embarrassed in the Charity Shield. We'd prefer 3 points and we've embarrassed them. While Newcastle chairman Sir John Hall adds, you've just seen the league champions today. I mean, to be fair to him, he is factually correct. Damien, this game comes up on Deserted Island Matches episodes of this show as a classic game too often, including for Rob. What do you remember about that afternoon in Newcastle destroying Manchester United?
Manchester United had been, heavily dominant, and they didn't show any signs of slowing down. You'll never win anything with kids, etc., etc. It was the kind of narrative around how they would win football matches as well was such that they just seemed to get it right, and they knew what to do. They would always have strong starts, and that's how they went on to win their leagues, right? So to go a goal down after 12 minutes, you still didn't. No one would have said, right, it's 5, lads. This is what we're doing. We're going in for 5. But then to be 2-0 down in 30 minutes, you go, well, Fergie's going to pull it out of the bag. He's going to have a second half. And then it didn't happen. And it just kept getting worse if you're a Man United fan. Better if you're a Newcastle United fan and you like goals scored by very suave, tall, sexy Belgians. It was just incredible. And as a neutral, I think Rob and I were discussing this while you were entering yourself with your technical problems before. Nowadays in the Premier League, you kind of, even as a Chelsea fan, right? We've had our purple patches. It's gone. Every now and again we might win a Champions League, but you kind of go, right, 3 games done. That's kind of it. Best you can hope for is top 4. Like just crack on. Those days you definitely felt that anyone could beat anyone, right? You felt that it was very possible. And these are one of those games when you look back in history, when you are coming up as a footballer, you think, I can do it. I don't have to be a Man United or a Liverpool. And you just felt that even as a Chelsea, right, well, actually, we could play United and, we might have a go. And certainly did wonders for Southampton, who played them in the very next game, right, and put 6 past them. And so, I'm not a pub quiz statistician, but worst Premier League defence back-to-back across 2 games, shipping 11 has to be up there. Like, I know in the modern era, Southampton got absolutely dicked over by Leicester City, like 9-0 or something. But losing 11 in 2 games has got to, David slayed Goliath twice in successive matches. That's got to give anyone hope.
That Newcastle game in particular just felt like there was just this pure rage from the frustration of the previous season and then being embarrassed in the Charity Shield. It felt like it was all unleashed on Manchester United in those nights.
And also Biker Grove had gone shit by this point, so they really needed something to be happy about.
a pick me up for the region, absolutely.
Yeah, PG had gone blind by this point, I think, hadn't they?
Yeah,
but it's quite an interesting game because imagine, I suppose, if you think about the Premier League era in the 90s, if you think about, imagine Man City or Liverpool or Arsenal letting 11 goals over a period of like 5 games or 4 games. There'd be like an inquisition on Monday Night Football. The fact they did it back to back is incredible. And to Southampton, obviously Newcastle, you got the time. I think Chelsea did Man U 5-0 at one point, didn't they? When they had Taibbi in goal or something around that. But that you can kind of understand that. But the Southampton one was just like an aberration, wasn't it?
Yeah, a real freak game. I mean, can you name? You've referenced one in terms of the Belgian. Can you between you name all 5 scorers in that game? Can you remember?
Shearer must have scored.
Shearer scored and got 2 assists, so I'll have half a point for that.
Okay.
Rob Lee.
Rob Lee did not.
Oh.
David Batty.
Batty didn't. Shearer's strike partner.
Ferdinand.
Another soon-to-be Spur.
Ginola.
The Belgian that you mentioned.
Philippe Albert, yeah.
Philippe Albert, but there's one more, and this is the one that probably most people would forget. Named after an exotic bird.
Right. Was it Spuggy?
It was famous Brazilian Spuggy. The 5th goal, well, not the 5th goal, sorry, but Darren Peacock was also on the score sheet that day. Well done if you got that at home. And as you've already referenced, this must be one of the biggest wobbles Manchester United have in the Fergie era, because after that St James's Park defeat, they lose 6-3 at Southampton and then 2-1 at home to Chelsea in their first league defeat at Old Trafford for almost 2 years. It leaves them 6th going into November. Their 9-game unbeaten start to the season has come to a very abrupt end. A 1-0 win over Arsenal, featuring one of the worst own goals you're likely to ever see in Premier League football from Nigel Winterburn. I would highly recommend going and finding that at some point after this show. Does arrest the slide and is crucial, as the Gunners are already looking to force under Wenger and spend the early months exchanging top spot with Liverpool and Newcastle themselves. Wenger's men will win 2-1 at St James's Park to keep up the charge and finish November top of the table, while Newcastle's 7-1 win over Spurs in December also keeps them in touch at the top. Rob, by New Year's Eve, Liverpool's win at the Dell takes them 5 points clear at the top. They have played a game or two more than the teams around them, but they've got 42 points. They're looking very strong. This is a Liverpool side that, aside from a Coca-Cola Cup in 95, are nearly men for much of the 90s in this early Premier League era. What do you think they were missing to make that step to become real serious contenders to Manchester United?
The manager. I don't think they had the right man in the dugout, to be honest. I think they had lots of talented players. They had lots of young players coming through. I think one thing that Souness had done, for all the things he did badly, he did try and make sure that Liverpool had some young players coming through, and he tried to blood them when he could. I just don't think Roy Evans had that like killer instinct that Ferguson had, or Kenny Dalglish certainly, or Arsene Wenger when he arrived. I think he's a little bit like Kevin Keegan, in the sense that you could set up a team, you could attack, you'd be fun to watch, you could buy the right players, but they always felt like they were just happy to be there. Whereas Ferguson was only happy if you weren't there. You know, if he was going to kind of exclude you from any title race or any kind of enjoyment for your team, to Ferguson was like his kryptonite, I think. And he was just wanting to create this team and squad that would just basically destroy all comers. And I think that was one of the things. He wanted to destroy Liverpool's records, didn't he? He wanted to basically come for them as much as he could, and did in the end. It's tough to say, because I think Roy Evans probably did quite a good job at Liverpool, because they were rock bottom after Souness had left. And then when Houllier came in, obviously he started to win some trophies. But that period of time, I think Roy Evans does stabilise Liverpool quite a bit. But he probably just doesn't have that sort of ruthless streak for me. In, you know, the whole Spice Boy era and all that kind of stuff, you know, you hear the ex-players say, it was just a Saturday night that we were having fun. It's like, yeah, and that's great. But, you know, you were doing it in London, 4 hours on a train away from Liverpool, whereas Manchester were just doing it on the pubs of Manchester and were kind of local and that kind of thing. I think they didn't maybe get attracted to the bright lights. They were just alcoholics. But
yeah,
that side, great to watch, and they were involved in some of the best games in Premier League history. Just not sure that Evans was the man who was ever going to get them over the line.
Maybe just didn't have that cutting instinct, and a bit nice, perhaps, yeah. And Damien, Wimbledon are 4th at the turn of the year. I've already mentioned they were near second at various points as well. They got 2 games in hand at that point as well that would have taken them top, which again seems remarkable in this area of anyone could beat anyone. For anyone who didn't live through it, how would you describe Joe Kinnear's crazy gang?
As a Chelsea fan, annoying. as a Premier League neutral, a fairy tale, and as a resident of Milton Keynes, it's like catching your eye in someone's party, fancying the pants off them, but then not seeing them again for years until they move into the empty house next to you and you find out they're single. Like if you lived in Milton Keynes, you must have been like, "Oh, that's some football in it," and then just like, "Whoa, okay, got it." They were that variable that wasn't supposed to be there. You know, Forest would have liked to have been that variable. Coventry, Sunderland, Middlesbrough had that, right? And that's the sort we'll come on to, right? They kind of had this fact of when Middlesbrough turn up, you don't know what's going to happen. But, you know, Wimbledon consistently just didn't give a monkeys. And you had Joe Kinnear, a great personality, a great motivator, would get you set for the match. You had a couple of nutcases in there that were really up for it. And it was kind of the death of the era of that football. You know, this season you've got Tony Adams with his problems. Paul Merson is coming back from his addictions, right? And certainly Arsene Wenger was cleaning up Arsenal at a rate of knots. Wimbledon were going absolutely the other way, yet it was working. If you'd have had Disney Plus or Prime Video back then, Fly on the Wall, Crazy Gang would have been, you know, something else. But yeah, they were just entertaining, right? I don't want to say the Harlem Globetrotters of football because that would big them up a little bit too much. But Wimbledon just had something about them that was deliberately different, and you know, had an owner who was born in a different breed.
And they had some really good players as well. Some of the talent they had. One of the goals on some of the reviews, like Marcus Gale scores a great goal. I think it's against Chelsea actually at Stamford Bridge, and he kind
Didn't see
gets past about three players and bends it in the corner. But you could see that they had some quality. I think Warren Barton goes to Newcastle after this season, or
I think I think he's probably gone by this season. I think,
But they had some really good players, and you know, defensively they were pretty good. They were pretty horrible. Pretty horrible as well. Weren't they? You just they never knew when they would beat. I think was the positive thing about them. It must have been a great time to be a Wimbledon fan because they got to the semi-final of the FA Cup as well, didn't they, this season?
Beaten on their way there by Chelsea. There is a BT Sport film actually made about them, kind of more in the 80s era, but the likes of John Scales, who does actually end up at Liverpool and is a very nice man. It maybe backs up this point about Liverpool being a bit nice, just kind of said that it was just too much for him. Some of the stuff that was going on in training, some of the initiations going on was just actually quite frightening. On the 29th of January, Chris Perry puts Wimbledon 1-0 up at Old Trafford. The in-play league at that point would have had them 3 points off the top with 2 games in hand. Instead, 2 late goals from Ryan Giggs and Andy Cole mean they lose 2-1 and the hosts return to the top of the table for the first time in over 4 months. Maybe a turning point in the title race, although perhaps a stretch to say that Wimbledon could have gone the distance. It's where Manchester United will remain until the end of the season, as we know, while the Dons do slip down the table. It's remarkable to think they wouldn't even be a club in their current formation just a few seasons later. Manchester United beat Arsenal 2-1 at Highbury, a huge result for Fergie's men that's best remembered for Ian Wright versus Peter Schmeichel, and a pretty tasty 2-footed challenge that actually happens after the ball's gone from the England striker on his Danish opponent. That also leads to a bit of a rivalry for quite a few years there. Liverpool lose 1-0 at Villa Park on the 1st of March. Remarkably, it's the first goal they'd conceded in the league since New Year's Day. And going into the latter months, Manchester United lose 2-1 at Roker Park on the same weekend Arsenal win, while Newcastle go to Anfield and improbably manage to lose 4-3 yet again, before Fergie's men suffer their 5th defeat of the season at home to Derby. Paolo Wanchop scores an iconic goal in that game to keep the door ajar for Liverpool and Arsenal in the chasing pack. We did have Ashley Ward on an earlier episode of the show. He told me that basically there was almost a riot in the Derby dressing room when Paolo Wanchop was named to make his debut at Old Trafford, given he'd never played at anything like the level that he was about to go into. And as Ashley admitted, he probably had to eat his words as Paolo Wanchop went through the Manchester United defence like a knife through butter and scored that goal. Manchester United face 4 games in 9 days at the season's end. The beginnings of fixture congestion in the Premier League era starting to add up. They want the season extending, something which Arsene Wenger has a strong opinion on. Fergie observes in the aftermath of the Derby game that Arsene Wenger seems to have a comment every week. He has no experience of English football. He's come from Japan. He's telling everyone how to organise their football. Unless you have the experience of what we've been through a few years ago, playing 4 games in 8 days, I think think you should keep your mouth shut, firmly shut. He keeps a lid on it, but it's about the closest I think you ever see to Fergie having a Keegan-style meltdown. It's also the first time we can truly observe the Frenchman getting under Fergie's skin. Rob, they're the best of friends now in their more mature years. This season, though, is, of course, the beginning of an epic rivalry between Fergie and Wenger, and there was no love lost during that time. What was it about their relationship that made their rivalry so compelling?
It was genuine competition, I think. I think Ferguson realised, as you were saying before about Liverpool, even Blackburn to a certain extent, and maybe Newcastle, he was never going to be that worried about them because he probably knew that they weren't sort of built on really solid foundations that would last afterwards. Whereas I think he probably knew about Wenger, that Wenger had success at Monaco in the late 80s and early 90s. He was kind of a bit of a pretender to the throne, if you like. He was changing things at Arsenal. Arsenal had won titles earlier on. They had that sort of history not that long ago. And I think he knew that Wenger could actually build a side and a squad and probably over 3 or 4 years really, really come to challenge United. And I think it probably scared him. It's the first time you think Ferguson might break. Keegan didn't do that to him. Dalglish did it to him a cent, but I think he was just more pissed off that he lost out on Alan Shearer. You know what I mean? It wasn't like a massive thing. It was just the fact that he got annoyed, but he was quite happy because the year after he got Roy Keane. So it's kind of one of those things where it was probably a bit tit for tat. But I think Wenger had that possibility to have that long-term rivalry with Ferguson, who loved winning. And I think that's the thing. When you get to a point where you're winning, and they'd won, 3 of the previous 4 seasons, if you see anyone who you think's got a genuine chance of knocking you off your perch, what are you going to do? You're going to fight fire with fire, basically. And that's what Ferguson does. Some of those interviews are great. And that one that he has about Wenger, where he starts saying, he's from Japan, he can't talk about English football. It's brilliant, because that's the kind of drama and narrative the Premier League was built on.
I think with Wenger, he thought, okay, this is going to be a tougher nut to crack, and someone that's going to take it a bit football a bit more seriously, and isn't going to be in the pub all night, right? I've got to. Here's a chance for me to evolve as a manager. I'm going to grow to become a better manager because you're here, and you see that healthy competition time and time again. Never mind the old, pub league physique and the Gordon Strackens and the Ron Atkinsons and the Brian Littles. And well, actually, I can get you. You're pretty easy to work out. I've managed a lot of you. You're quite easy to beat up here. But then Wenger was probably one of the first ones where he was like, okay, this is going to be tough. And actually, you go on to see United be even better in a couple of no spoilers, but 98, 99 is good for United. And I think that's probably as a result, because otherwise he probably would have got bored, right? He probably needed a Wenger in the league to challenge him.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, they push each other on. Man United bounced back from that defeat against Derby to pick up 3 points at both Ewood Park and then at Anfield in quick succession. The Liverpool game in particular, a huge turning point on the night the home team would have gone top themselves with 3 to play had they won. It means the Red Devils can afford to drop points in their game in hand against Leicester and draw 3-3 at home to Middlesbrough before sealing the title on the 6th of May, 1997 without kicking a ball. As the only 2 sides who can still overturn their lead both fail to win, Newcastle finished goalless at West Ham and Liverpool lose 2-1 at Wimbledon. The only crumb of comfort for the Merseysiders coming when teenage sub Michael Owen makes his debut, replacing Robbie Fowler and scoring, becoming the youngest scorer in the club's history at 17 years and 144 days old. It will be another 2 decades before Ben Woodburn breaks that record in a League Cup tie. Damien, it's Manchester United's 4th title in 5 years. They seem to have an aura around them that make them seem almost unstoppable. What was it about them in this period that made them so successful?
I like that Michael Owen stat. It's like the bonus bit at the end of the credits of a movie, and you go, oh, I don't know, and then you go, yay! It's really good. But what, as I kind of spoke about, like, I think Ferguson was a great headspace manager, and he knew how to take the majority of people in his dressing room and manipulate is the right. You want to say get the best out of, but actually it's more specific than that. It is a manipulation, but it's pre-agreed. Please manipulate me and pay me lots of money and make me world famous manipulation, right? I trust you to get into my head without me really knowing it and turn me into a better player. And the majority of players that came in through Manchester United in his time did that. And I think he just knew that was get your psychology right for a fast start. In his office, he would have pictures of birds flying in formation. right? You know, that kind of inverted V, and he was like, that's how I want my teams to play. Why can't my teams play that? And that's a great sort of visualization, rather than get stuck in, break his legs, pinch his ass, you know, knock him off that kind of rough and tough. You get that from Roy Keane in Spades, right? You know, that's kind of part of your makeup, that kind of grittiness that he spoke about, that you'll see from Eric Cantona time and time again. But he also like really believed in the psychology of football, but from his own lived experience, not from a textbook. And I think he had 10 years. By this point, he'd been at Old Trafford for 10 years, and had seen that develop pretty quickly. I think that when he hit his formula, he knew exactly who he needed. So also, you don't want to hire somebody who's unmanageable or uncoachable. And I don't think he had too many of them come in. So to be able to bring in those kids, to know the psychology of bringing in the Butts and the Beckhams and the Skulls, was another masterstroke. And he must have known that he knew he could get the best out of them. Because of course, if you take the David Beckham roadshow out of all of this, you know, with that wonder goal, they famously said in the highlights, right, Beckham at that point was only scoring amazing goals. That just added to the kind of silver status that this club had, that it was doing something really special. And you know, for a long time, he knew how to get the best out of David Beckham too. So and to be able to bring Eric Cantona back from the brink, right? That's a masterstroke. So never mind your Sabutio players in the dressing room at halftime. It was all up there.
A remarkable manager who reinvents himself and reinvents his teams several times. Moving on to the top goal scorers for this season, a few familiar names from earlier seasons of the Premier League, one or two new players as well who continue to make an impact in the seasons ahead. Let's start from the bottom up. A lower scoring amount gets you in the top 10 this year. The three joint 10th players are Matt Le Tissier, Dion Dublin and Juninho, with 13 goals apiece, all talisman for three struggling sides this season. Les Ferdinand and Fabrizio Ravanelli are tied in sixth place with 16 goals apiece. Plenty of goals in the northeast this season, at opposite ends of the table. Dwight York is fifth with 17, still at Aston Villa. Joint third is Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, a new name on the list and a new signing, and Robbie Fowler, who both get 18 each. Ian Wright is in second with 23 goals, and Alan Shearer is the Golden Boot winner once again with 25 from 31 games as well. Lads, this is Alan Shearer's third consecutive Golden Boot in his first season at Newcastle. He's still only 26. There is something quite significant about this particular Golden Boot, though. So can you, or I wonder if anyone at home knows what is significant about this Golden Boot?
Was it a different foot?
No, it's a good. I mean, I love the left field approach. Literally.
No, I don't know. We don't know, Carl. Please tell us.
It's actually the last one he wins, which I find a little surprising. 1997, still only 26. He doesn't win another Premier League Golden Boot. Damien, no Chelsea players in this top 10. They do spread the goals around a little bit this season between Vialli, Zola and Hughes. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, though, we just touched on him. He's a new name. He scores 18 in 33. Quite a few of those off the bench as well. He scores a goal every 123 minutes in the Premier League this season, which is quite an incredible record for a new player coming in. £2.5 million from Mould. Surely one of Fergie's best ever signings. Would you agree?
Yeah. You have to look at his signings in their entirety, right? For every Cristiano Ronaldo or Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, there's a Kleberson or an Anderson, or a Veron, or a Gabriel Obertan, or a David Bellion, or a Ralph Milne, right? He signed a lot of players. And the law of averages tells you, if you put your hand in a Quality Street tub at Christmas, eventually you're going to pull out the one you want. I'm being slightly facetious. Only that, in case you couldn't tell, only in as much as there was no clear indication that he was going to perform at the level that you've just described, let alone go on to do something special in a couple of years' time. Try not to give it away. He definitely had his purple patch at United as a footballer. There was no way that if you were a smart, intelligent young man that did exactly what you were told, that you wouldn't go on to achieve success. And I think he picked a guy that listened, that was fast, didn't let anything get in the way, right? He was probably not at strip clubs at 4 o'clock in the morning. He's probably still tucked up in bed with his nightlight on.
Couldn't get in without ID, could he?
You know what I mean?
That was probably
it'd be somebody's backpack like Yoda. But no, to honestly, to hit the ground running in the Premier League at this point, littered with huge stars. You even watch the highlights, and you've got Chris Waddle, you've got John Barnes still banging them in, Peter Beardsley is still playing, right? Ian Wright, Dennis Bergkamp. It's a phenomenal who's who of footballing talent globally in this division, and just to come in and go, I don't really know a great deal of anything, but I've just been told to do this, and I'm going to do it, and it's going to work, right? That is, that's seriously impressive. So I think never mind the money, like £2.5 million in today's money. I don't know what that's worth. 3 or 4 Moyes Caicedos. It's painful. But yeah, no, I think he got it right. He definitely got it right.
And Rob, I love a stat, but even I haven't managed to work this one out, so I'm going to throw it over to you instead. There surely can't have ever been another side to have been relegated who had 2 players in the top 10 goal scorers for the season. Obviously, Ravanelli and Juninho, what a combination they were. What was it like watching them that season?
I think for any Borough fan talking about this season, it's like you just get immediate PTSD, because when you start the season, you think you're going to easily get in the top 6 or the top 8 because, like you say, Wimbledon are up there, Sheffield Wednesday are up there, Chelsea are up there, Villa are up there. You kind of feel like you can compete, and then it all falls apart. But you've still got the memories, and watching those 2 players, I think I'd said before that it was my first year as a season ticket holder. We started off the season drawing 3-3 with Liverpool. We beat West Ham by 4 early on in the season. We beat Coventry by 4. We were smashing 5, 6, 7 past teams in like cup competitions. We beat Newcastle in the cup competition to get to a cup final. I think watching these 2 players play was just amazing. I think it's probably a time that, although when we got into European finals and won the Carling Cup, we had the likes of Mendieta, Hasselbank, Viduka, Yakubu. We probably got it right that time. But Robson was unlucky. I think we probably were a little bit too quick with what we did. Juninho loved the place because he was young and he was desperate to come to Europe, and he kind of fit in straight away. He used to, it's the cliche. He was playing footy on the field outside his house with kids and signing shirts and stuff. And then Ravanelli said, "Who can play football in this dump?" Do you know what I mean? It was kind of very different because they trained on a prison. Ravanelli had come from Juventus, who were probably the premier club in the world at that point, and he'd come to Borough. So I think he's probably not remembered that well. When you look back at a lot of his goals, they're scruffy, horrible 1990s goals. Do you know what I mean? Shearer's banging him in from 35 yards out and doing all kinds, and Ravanelli's like squirming the ball past keepers. It does look a bit different, but he's got 31 goals in a season. He gets 15 cup goals to go with his 16 in the league. It's crazy. And Juninho, I think, what is disappointing, I think, as a Borough fan, not that he went abroad, that he got a bad injury from Salgado before the 98 World Cup, is that Ferguson didn't go for him. After we played them in that 3-3 draw, Ferguson basically said, nobody knows what to do with this player. You can't do anything with him. And them and Liverpool seriously looked at buying him. But 12 million, 12.5 million was probably quite a lot still. I know Shearer gone for 15, but it's still an awful lot of money to pay. And they didn't really want to pay it, but it's a shame that he left the Premier League in his prime. I think is probably as a Borough fan, thinking about it now, it would have been great if he could have stayed longer, as good as he was.
Yeah. A joyous player to watch and a real favourite for neutrals as well. Okay, on to the season's relegation battle. Sorry, Rob, no rest for you here. It's a closer run thing than the race at the top. Let's start with the teams that flirted with relegation this season before climbing to safety. 2 of the decade's league champions are slow out of the blocks. Life after Alan Shearer gets off to a difficult start for Blackburn Rovers as they have to wait until November for their first 3 points of the season. A 3-0 win over title-chasing Liverpool under caretaker boss Tony Parks, who guides Rovers out of the relegation zone by Christmas and towards relative safety. Meanwhile, Leeds sack Howard Wilkinson after an indifferent start to the season and bring back George Graham, who loses 5 of his first 6 games before getting a tune out of the Elland Road outfit and lifting them to mid-table 2. West Ham spend the winter months looking over their shoulders with just 1 win in 14 between Halloween and late February before a Julian Dix-inspired 4-3 win over Spurs on a blustery Monday Night Football at Upton Park is the beginning of a run in form that just about sees them over the line. And Everton's 6th place finish the previous May feels like a distant memory as they sleepwalked within a whisker of a relegation battle and Joe Royle leaves mid-season in an ominous preview of what 97-98 will have in store for them. Rob, that run of one win in 14 games over the course of almost 4 months would surely get any manager the sack in 2023. Is it a sign of the times that Harry Redknapp rides that storm, or is it just his popularity at West Ham, a mix of the two? What do you reckon?
I think it was just a completely different time for managers. I think it's also quite interesting not to think about the managers, but to think about like the structure of the league, the finance that was involved. We got relegated this season, obviously, and then in the summer we spent £5 million on Paul Merson. You know, it kind of, when you got relegated, it wasn't, you know, the end of days. It wasn't the apocalypse that was coming, and you hoped that the parachute payments would pay for, you know, all your ridiculous wages that you've given to players who you thought were going to keep you in the Premier League but didn't. I think Redknapp probably had enough sort of, well, cash in the bank metaphorically and actually cash in the bank to keep West Ham where they were long term, really, and probably keep his job. West Ham were probably one of those clubs at the time where you just thought, yeah, they'll do this and they'll do that. They'll bring a couple of players in, they'll get it over the line, and we'll start all over again. And they were kind of a little bit like what Everton are like now. You know, it wasn't probably till the late 90s, early 2000s that you thought Redknapp was a decent manager. I'm not sure he was kind of thought of as a really good manager at this point. It's interesting, obviously, he wins 1 in 14. I'm going to raise you, Harry Redknapp, to Brian Robson, who competes brilliantly with him to win only 1 in 16 games with a Borough side that would get to 2 cup finals, score the 5th or 6th most amount of goals in the league, and then incredibly only lose 2 of the last 12 games, but still go down. So he didn't get sacked. He didn't get sacked until 4 years later when Terry Venables had to come and hold his hand to keep us from relegation. So there was a lot of faith in managers probably at that point. They probably had a lot more power than they do now, I would say. They weren't part of sort of a labyrinthine sporting director structure or co-sporting directors or whatever they have these days. It was manager chairman, and if you weren't going, you weren't going.
Those are the runners of riders. Let's focus on the 5 teams that are in the thick of it for much of the campaign. In Middlesbrough, Sunderland, Coventry, Southampton and Nottingham Forest. Coventry dip into the transfer market and bring in Gary McAllister, Gary Breen and Darren Huckabee. And with the goals of Dion Dublin, have just enough as a result. Southampton, meanwhile, strengthened with Klaus Lundekvarm, Eyal Berkovic, Egil Ostenstadt and Ali Dia in one of the Premier League era's most memorable signings. Now, clearly in 2023, there's an embarrassment of resources to check a player's CV. But back in 1996, you just had to get your mate from uni to ring Graham Souness, tell him you're George Weah, and suggest that he should sign some bloke who is apparently your cousin. It worked. Souness signed Dia on a 1-month trial contract, believing he had a 13-cap Senegalese international on his hands. Remarkably, despite a questionable performance in training and dodging a debut for the reserves due to a waterlogged pitch, Dia found himself on the bench for a home game against Leeds United. So imagine his surprise then when he got the nod to take off his training bib and replace the greatest player in Southampton's history in the 32nd minute. Of the change, Matt Letitia, who is no stranger to a bit of in-depth research on the internet himself, said he ran around the pitch like Bambi on ice. It was very, very embarrassing to watch. Dia would later suffer the ignominy of being subbed for Ken Moncau. He didn't do well today, but we won't just judge him on 60 minutes, said Souness after the match. However, after turning up for treatment for an injury with the team physio on Sunday, he then left and was never seen again. He's regularly voted the worst transfer of all time. Damien, Southampton and Coventry are perennial strugglers once again and spend most of the season either in the bottom 3 or on the very edges of it, but do just enough. What do those two teams have season after season that perhaps sides with more individual talent, Middlesbrough perhaps, who still went down, didn't have?
I think somebody in the dugout to put a rocket up the players' arses time and time again, like to put the fear of God into them that they need to actually do something. And, you know, that sort of stuff doesn't work anymore, right? They'll get in their Maseratis and drive home and go, oh, but my house is still here and it's worth millions of pounds. In those days, there wasn't the kind of maybe the bankability, and there was probably still more at risk, and you probably could address footballers in a more direct manner. Graham Souness doesn't get much more direct than that, right? Shouted so hard his moustache fell off. And yeah, Gordon Strachan at Coventry, right? Same sort of thing, just really Scottish, gritty, hard. But I think it was maybe even the evolution of where we are now, which is a team that's built around an individual or has one or two star players will not survive in this era. You could be all anonymous, right? You could Brighton completely interchangeable, right? If you like, in the nicest way possible. I think they're a fantastic team. But back then it was like, we've got one or two lads, just give the ball to them. And actually that just cut out the supply. Game over. Very difficult. So I think they got away with it for a while, but I just don't think it's it was a dying way of trying to win football matches.
Letitia does score fewer goals this season, and it nearly cost Southampton dear. Speaking of individual talents, let's get on to Middlesbrough. Having added Ravanelli and Emerson to a squad that already had Janino pulling the strings, the Teessiders were a thrilling watch in the opening weeks, with a 3-3 draw against Liverpool and convincing wins over West Ham and Coventry, lifting them to 4th in the early season table. A run of poor form, the demanding nature of 2 cup runs to Wembley, and crucially, of course, a 3-point deduction for supposedly failing to follow FA procedure in postponing a game at Ewood Park in December would ultimately see them return to Division 1 after just 2 seasons back in the top flight that had seemed so full of promise. Rob, you and I have covered that points deduction, and we've covered it on other episodes of the show as well. Instead, let's allow ourselves the chance to fantasize about what might have been. Borough do come back within the season. They do have a sustained and successful spell in the top flight after coming back. Is relegation just a bump in the road, or did it stunt the eventual potential of what Middlesbrough could have achieved?
So I started my season ticket journey with Middlesbrough in 1996 with that 3-3 draw against Liverpool. 10 years later, I was standing in the stadium at Eindhoven, having just lost the UEFA Cup final. So if you look at it from sort of that point of view, that 10-year period where we've gone from wanting to be challenging in the Premier League and doing well at the top half of the table, 10 years later, we got to a European final and we'd won an honour along the way. We'd seen some great players. So you could argue, no, it didn't stunt any growth. It didn't kind of stop us achieving what Steve Gibson wanted to achieve. It would have been interesting to see what would have happened if, because obviously those 3 points we deducted put us down. It wasn't actually because we didn't have enough points on the pitch. We did. We just had 3 of them taken away. I think that summer would have been quite a big summer for the club. There's all sorts of rumours that, they'd had negotiations with Batistuta already to move him to Middlesbrough to play with Ravanelli. There was rumours that we were backing for Roberto Carlos again. There's all kinds of things that might have happened for Borough at that point. Another season of Emerson, another season of Ravanelli, another season of Janino potentially could have totally transformed where we were as a club. We basically forgot to buy any defenders until January, which is one of the issues that we had. Basically, when Nigel Pearson and Gianluca Festa were fit and played together, even, with holograms for fullbacks, we probably still would have stayed up. We bought Schwarzer too late. So all those things, we kind of had the top end of the pitch, we'd kind of sorted out. And then we just kind of forgot that you had to defend. Whereas the previous year, we defended quite well, but couldn't score. And it was like, well, this year we'll buy a load of forwards, and then maybe next year we'll get some defenders. And like Damien was saying, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We at one point, we had Clayton Blackmore was playing right or left back at some point. We had Vladimir Kindra we brought over. We had Curtis Fleming still knocking around. Chris Morris was knocking around. We had Phil Stamp filling in because we didn't have any players. Chris Freestone, who exactly, at that time filling in. We had Andy Campbell, who's a young. All these names were playing quite a lot of games for what we had on the pitch, or the potential that we had on the pitch. I would love to have seen another season, but I can't complain having been to 3 consecutive Wembley finals. We got promoted the following year and got to see one of the best seasons I've ever seen in Paul Merson. Win the Carling Cup, finish 7th in the league, get to your UEFA Cup final. Your manager goes to manage England. It's not a bad 10 years for a club the size of Middlesbrough, really.
Meanwhile, Nottingham Forest top the Premier League on opening day and finish it bottom. Surely the only time that's ever happened. There's too many draws send them back down after 3 seasons back. A look at their top joint scorers tells its own story. With 6 apiece, it's Alf Inge Haaland who will save his goal-scoring exploits for the fruits of his loins, and opening day hat-trick hero Kevin Campbell, who scores as many goals against Coventry on opening day as he does for the rest of the season put together. Stuart Pearce has quite a season. A few months after putting his penalty ghosts to bed at Euro 96 twice and filming a pizza advert with Gareth Southgate and Chris Waddle, the England legend is thrust into the Nottingham Forest hot seat in December after Frank Clark's resignation, where he remains for the rest of the season. He does win Manager of the Month for January. Following victory in his opening match against Arsenal, where Haaland scores both goals in a 2-1 win, he admitted that after 4 hours moving names around a piece of paper to select a side out of his first 11, he settled on a team that he thought looked unbeatable and made him question how Forest were in so much trouble. That's when he showed his wife, who pointed out that he'd forgot to name Mark Crossley in goal. Psycho was playing 4-4-3. With 2 games of the season to go, no side has been relegated and the entire bottom half are still in striking distance. It sets up an epic final week of the season. Nottingham Forest are the first to go after dropping points at home to Wimbledon. They'll finish bottom. Middlesbrough lead 3-1 at Old Trafford, but are pegged back to a 3-3 draw in a game that would have taken them out of the bottom 3 if it wasn't for that pesky points deduction. On the final day, Coventry climbed from 19th to 17th with a 2-1 win at Spurs in an agonisingly delayed kickoff to ultimately send Sunderland down. The Mackhams could have saved themselves with a win at Wimbledon, but lose it late on. We'll cover them in a little more detail in the final section of the show. The same goes for Middlesbrough, who needed a win at Elland Road. Brian Dean scores late on for the hosts. Juninho equalises soon after, but it's not enough. Borough are down. Without the points deduction, they'd have finished 14th. At least there's an FA Cup final to look forward to. So we're going to take a short break from 96-97 now to begin picking the greatest player from Burkina Faso in the Premier League era. This is our Premier League of Nations Hall of Fame. Until recently, there had been just one player in the Premier League from Burkina Faso, the West African nation, with a population of 22 million, who sit 56th in the world rankings, just behind Finland, but ahead of Venezuela. The choice would have been simple, with Bertrand Traoré going straight into the Hall of Fame. But in 22-23, a Bournemouth player joined the ranks, and 23-24 has seen an additional player from Luton Town make his Premier League debut as well. So here is your shortlist. Is it Dango Ouattara, the 21-year-old Bournemouth forward who began his career in his native country for Majestic FC before a move to France with Lorient? He announced himself to the Premier League shortly after a January 2023 move with a 95th minute winner at Spurs. He also has 6 goals in his 14 caps at the time of recording. Or is it Issa Kabore, the Manchester City fullback on loan at Luton Town for the season after several stints in Belgium and France, including 22 appearances for Marseille? At the time of recording this, he has got just the 1 Premier League appearance, so there's not too much to report on, but he has also got 30 caps for his national side, despite still being just 22. And StatVans, he was born on the same day that Michael Owen's late brace secured the FA Cup for Liverpool against Arsenal in 2001, just in case you remember that game as well as I do and want to feel old. Or is it Bertrand Traoré after all, the Aston Villa forward, who's also appeared for Chelsea? A full international, aged just 15. He's also been at Vitesse, Ajax and Lyon and spent much of last season on loan in Turkey. Commanding a reported fee of £17 million to join Villa, he's still a little way off repaying that at the time of recording. I guess £70 million is pin money these days, so who am I to judge? So chaps, who is the greatest Burkinabe player in the Premier League? Is it Bertrand Traoré, Issa Kabore or Dango Ouattara? Let's come to you first, Damien. What do you reckon?
Well, believe it or not, Bertrand Traoré has a cousin who used to play for PSG and made 14. No, he didn't. That's Ali Dia again.
You had me hook, line and sinker. It's so easily done, isn't it?
Easily done. Proof. Graham Souness is not as stupid as he looks. I will go for Bertrand Traoré purely because of the Blues connection, because I remember watching him for a brief spell at Chelsea and thinking this kid is like lightning, right? He wanted to run up and down the wing, backwards and forwards, and he loved to shoot, right? And I think he would have been right at home in Premier League season 96-97, where goals were screamers and they were absolutely pile drivered in from 25, 30 yards out. He would have been right at home, given free rein to run up and down and do whatever he wants. But when he was under Jose Mourinho, kind of a disciplinarian and really strict, and was like, no, and shipped him out really quickly. So I think he's probably the greatest Burkina Faso player in the Premier League, but just born too late. Put him in a Newcastle shirt, then he would have won the league.
Yeah, I agree with Damien as well. I think the other two young players might have good careers, but Traoré, he was another one of those ones who, when you're at a big club and you end up moving down, if you like, to sort of a mid-range club like an Aston Villa, you think, oh, do you know what, this is going to be their chance. They're going to show what they can do. They're going to be let off the leash. But actually, it goes the opposite way, because you're not in a top 4 or top 6 team, there's almost even more restrictions, and you kind of felt like he probably had that for quite a bit of his time in the Premier League. He had some good loan spells, to be fair. I think he's another one of those players who's always going to find a club because of the ability he's got. I just wonder if, like Damien was saying, I wonder what team he would have been. Imagine him in this Wimbledon side. He would have been like the wild card player, or even like, I bet Gordon Strachan would have loved this kind of player just so he could shout at him all game. He'd make him swap wings at halftime just so he could roar in his ear and kind of make his ears bleed as he tries to sort of keep them in the league. But yeah, I'd go for Bertrand Traore as well.
I like this idea of transporting him back and sticking him up front with Dean Holdsworth. That's marvellous. Well, you've heard what the lads think. We're going to put this out. We normally put this out on Twitter, X, whatever it's called these days. Check the When Football Began Again social media channels. We will put this out to a vote, and you will be able to have your say and see if you agree with the lads. And who knows what our 2 younger Burkina Faso players might go on to achieve. Okay, let's now look at some of the big transfers of the season and perhaps notice a bit of a theme after a bittersweet summer of football. Euro 96 Golden Boot winner and soon-to-be England captain Alan Shearer returns home to Newcastle United for a world record £15 million. Blackburn replacing with Georgios Donis, truly a sign that the dog days are over. Fabrizio Ravanelli and Emerson join the Middlesbrough Revolution. Manchester United bring in Karol Poborski, Ollie Solskjaer, Jordi Cruyff and Ronnie Johnson, while Ruud Gullit's star power brings some of Serie A's best talent in Gianluca Vialli, Roberto Di Matteo and Gianfranco Zola. Spurs also raid Serie A, but for Ramon Vega. I'm allowed to say that. I've asked him to come on the show 3 times. Van Hooijdonk swaps Celtic Park for the City Ground. Lee Sharp leaves Old Trafford for Ellen Road. Patrick Berger sets hearts aflutter at Anfield. And Arsenal bring in 20-year-old Patrick Vieira and 17-year-old Nicolas Anelka. I'm sure that's the last we'll be hearing about those 2. Rob, £15 million would barely cover the cost of a squad player at Stamford Bridge these days. For anyone who didn't live through it, just how big a transfer was Alan Shearer in 1996?
For me, at this time, especially when you're sort of just getting into football, there's 2 things that are the best things. It's football tournaments in the summer and transfers. And because we had Euro 96, riding a Britpop wave and all that kind of stuff, proper, really good summer of football, then you start getting some big transfers. There's nothing better. And because now you don't get a here we go every 10 minutes when someone's linked with another player, or, you know, someone on a message board forum just decides to create a transfer link and within an hour it's all over Twitter or whatever. It did feel like you were kind of waiting for the news. And if you didn't have Sky Sport, you're waiting for the news, you're waiting for newspapers to report signings or like the weekly football magazines. One of the things I think is interesting about this is Shearer costs more than Ronaldo, the real Ronaldo, this summer. He's, I think, the Brazilian Ronaldo Barca is about 13 million or 12.5 million. The fact that Shearer cost more than that, I kind of feel like I remember, because normally it wasn't English teams who were spending all this money on players. Obviously, the fees had gone up, and Andy Cole's gone for 7 million, Collimore's 8.5 million. But this felt so different. And, you know, the sheet metal worker's son was kind of, I feel like that's the memory of the words from that the sheet metal worker's son, Alan Shearer, comes out of St James's and says hello to all the Geordies. You know, it's that kind of, you feel like you really remember Look North, which was our local news, with the camera on him walking out to, you know, a load of barcodes shouting and screaming about their new hero. So it's kind of, I feel like it's quite transformational for Newcastle, but not necessarily for the transfer market in England just yet, because obviously the world transfer record goes a couple of years later with Danielson, but in England it was the record for quite a while. It's another 2 fingers to Ferguson as well, wasn't it? That was the other thing about the transfer, that Keegan got there and spent the money, and Ferguson was left with his Jordi Cruyff and Raymond van der Houw consolation prizes, really. But I mean, he was brilliant. Alan Shearer, I think he's criminally underrated still. I know the people say, how can you say he's underrated? Like, just go and watch his goals from 92 to 97 and tell me that he wouldn't be probably the best player in the league now. I think he was just so good.
Yeah, all kinds of goals. A real competitor on top of that. Damien, Chelsea ship out Paul Furlong, Gavin Peacock, Mark Steen, John Spencer and Terry Phelan. They replace him with some of Serie A's top talent. How exciting was that at the time, and how obvious was it that Chelsea were entering a brave new era?
Good question. I mean, a little bit of context. We had the 1994 FA Cup final. So I was 14-year-old boy. And, I'd gone through the heartache of Italian 90. And there was no World Cup 94 like Rob spoke about to be excited about that season. So for me, that was literally my cup final. And we got demolished 4-0. And I think for Ken Bates, who weirdly enough would sell the club less than like a decade later to some Russian guy, that must have been at that FA Cup final. I think was a watershed moment in his mentality, because pretty soon afterwards, Glenn Hoddle was starting to bring in some of these players. Right, Rud Hullet was already established. We had Dmitry Karim, kind of a sexy Russian goalkeeper. We were doing stuff already, and that together, like Ken Bates trying to as much as Fergie would have been a mastermind up there as a manager, I think Ken Bates really had that business hat on and knew how to craft what a football club should look like. Probably, again, looking at, no offence, a lot of the northern clubs and their models and how they would just, sink and swim and just yo-yo, and thinking, well, we were getting relegated left, right and centre in the 80s, and he bought the club for £1. How do I go as far away from that as quickly as possible? So I think when the Bosman ruling came into effect, it was a really good opportunity for him to go, okay, let's see who I could maybe bring back in the back of my car. So yeah, the likes of Zola, like you mentioned, world class. He didn't come into November, and will go on to win player of the year. Gianluca Vialli was on a free. Paul Parker, interestingly, although there were like business reasons for us bringing a lot of these players, 1996 was an injury crisis season for us. We shipped out a bunch of the guys that didn't win us the FA Cup final, and we had to bring in new blood anyway. But Paul Parker, who'd been a bit of a journeyman, having been injured and then displaced by Gary Neville at Manchester United, kind of went to Derby and to Fulham and kicked around, and we said, we really need a right back, would you come in please? He was absolutely superb for us in defence. So I think it was interesting just to see that we could believe in the quality of talent that we could attract. But there was no doubt we were looking at the likes of Janino and Emerson, who brought back the perm, although I think it was still trendy at that point in Middlesbrough, and Ravanelli, and thinking, my God, we would love these players. So it didn't as much of a halcyon period as it is now looking back on it, especially with the FA Cup final win. Sorry, Rob. We were in and amongst it with the likes of Middlesbrough, right, who were attracting all of this foreign talent. So really exciting to be in the running, but no idea how it would end up. And of course, we then go on to get Mark Hughes. So we were like, oh my God, like, we don't care that you're maybe not first choice for Man United anymore. You want to come to Chelsea, right? Obviously, there's that bravado that says, but I don't believe that. I think we were genuinely wanting to win stuff at this point, and we don't really care where you came from. It just felt like a really cosmopolitan time on the Fulham Road, and it was, it was good times.
Yeah, and must have sold that project, of course, as well, because Stamford Bridge is largely, for big parts of the season, still a bit of a building site. So actually, it's really selling that vision for what Chelsea will go on to become within a few years.
And like, I don't know if you touched it before, such an emotive season for Chelsea as well, losing our chief executive. That was Matthew Harding going was kind of I think October, November in the League Cup game. Was just another turning point, right? Everything happened for us around this kind of 90s period. Win, lose or bust. To lose one of your own, it wouldn't have mattered if we got relegated that season. We'd rather have had him back. But it didn't deter the ambitions of the club. And like I say, it was the beginning of the building blocks, really. And thankful that we were in the Premier League era at that point to be able to go on and do that.
Certainly one of the visionaries of this Chelsea revolution in Matthew Harding, who was tragically lost during this season. Managerial changes this season include Rud Hullet replacing outgoing England manager Glenn Hoddle at Chelsea, and Bruce Rioch sacking on the eve of the new season to later be replaced by little-known Frenchman Arsene Wenger. There's the return of two Scottish Grahams. George Graham arrives at Elland Road following the sacking of Leeds manager Howard Wilkinson just 4 years after winning the First Division title. And Graham Souness returns from planting flags in Turkish centre circles to replace Dave Merrington at Southampton. Gordon Strachan takes the reins at Coventry City midway through the season as Ron Atkinson moves upstairs and continues his broadcasting work with ITV, which I'm sure will be controversy-free. Joe Royal leaves Everton on transfer deadline day. The Blues legend would later describe his resignation as like a divorce that took a long time to get over. The disagreement came after the cash-strapped club refused to sanction his move for Norwegian striker Torre-Andre Flo, who will pop up the following season. Toffee's captain Dave Watson becomes caretaker manager and picks up 6 points from the final 7 games to keep Everton up by the skin of their teeth. And Kevin Keegan and Frank Clark leave Newcastle and Forest either side of Christmas and are replaced by Kenny Dalglish and Stuart Pearce, respectively, for the remainder of the season. Tony Parks begins the third of what will be 6 caretaker spells at Blackburn Rovers. The first was in 1986. The last was as late as 2004. He actually had a 39% win record across 74 games across all those spells, which is pretty decent. I'm sure you'll agree. A question for you both. Let's start with you, Rob. Out of all those incoming and outgoing managers that I've just mentioned, which of those, we've already talked about players we'd transport back into 1997, which of those managers might you bring forward to the present day to manage your side, and which ones might you give a clear steer to?
So I think it's a pretty easy choice for who I bring in. So that'd be Arsene Wenger, for obvious reasons, but the most fun is deciding who you wouldn't have. We've already had Gordon Strachan manage the club and try and transport us to the SPL for a period of time, which was a joyous experience. So I'm not going to pick him, but I am going to pick Howard Wilkinson, because I just kind of feel like we've had to suffer Tony Pulis, Neil Warnock, and to a certain extent Chris Wilder. So I just couldn't sit through another season of dull, boring football that kind of Wilkinson was producing at Leeds at this point. Yeah, I know he won a league title. He'd been a very successful manager, and some of his ideas were, really good and all that sort of stuff. But I just couldn't imagine having Howard Wilkinson in charge of the Borough now. I think Ron Atkinson would have been a bit of a laugh, to be honest. But I can't imagine someone who doesn't know which team he was managing actually doing a good job. And then, who would Graham Souness sign? You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, and going back to Howard Wilkinson, because he is actually credited. He moves into the England setup and is credited with kind of beginning to reform some of that entire thing for the success or relative success that the England team have seen in present day.
Yeah, I think he was obsessed with Clairefontaine in France. He'd sort of seen the impact it had. I'm not sure whether that might have been links that he'd had when he'd signed Cantona and stuff like that. But I know that he basically wanted to replicate that for England, and they tried to do it a little bit with St George's Park and had Lilleshall, obviously. But yeah, he tried to bring a lot of that in, which again, good ideas, but ideas don't win football matches, I'm afraid. Just like Brian Robson's ideas of not having a defence would keep him in the league.
Damien, what about you? Would you also bring back Arsene Wenger to 2023?
Well, I wouldn't have Dave Merrington because I don't remember him. But I would have, and I think the 90s is a great example of something that, I know the 90s is in fashion, so they tell me. I would have Stuart Pearce purely for his player-manager capabilities. And I think that's one of the elements we really lack in the Premier League. And certainly at Chelsea, Glenn Hoddle's gone off to play with Eileen What's-Her-Face in the England camp. Good luck to you. Reid, you fancy it? Yeah, sure. Sexiest man of the year, I'll go for it. Or similar accent. Reid gets replaced, right? Big egos in the dressing room. There was like commercial contracts and all sorts of clashes with him and Ken Bates, reportedly. But Gianluca Vialli, you're here. Do you fancy it? Yes, I fancy it. I give you the go. And well, it worked, right? They both won trophies season after season. Actually, 98-99, we did incredibly well with European trophies and that. So, and I just, as a Chelsea fan, right, I've got time for Pochettino. I don't want him to be a Jose tribute act, but I would be very happy if he did go at Christmas and they gave Thiago Silva the interim role for the. Why not? Like, I just don't try and outthink it, lads. Just get on with it. Pick the most seasoned player in the dressing room and say, you got 15 games, have a pop. What could be worse than Graham Potter? Give it a go.
3 player managers in a row for Chelsea, and Gordon Strachan, of course, comes in as player manager and saves Coventry.
Yeah, and Brian Robson was also a player manager this season. He played, I think, on his 40th birthday around that time in a game against Arsenal in January. I think even Viv Anderson was registered as a player at one point. It was that desperate.
My wife got me a pair of socks, load of rubbish. I want a game of football. I'm going in.
And Brian Robson, of course, with the ultimate player manager launch photo, suit and tie on the top half, shorts and socks on the bottom a few seasons earlier. A definitive image of 90s football. Okay, we're now going to move on to goal of the season. I will put in the description for this show the link to Sky Sports' kind of summary of the best goals of this season. This, I think, actually is probably one of the most difficult to shortlist just 4 from. In the end, I've shortlisted 4 goals that I think at least are all genuinely iconic in the fact that if I describe them and you remember this season, you'll probably be able to remember them. However, special mentions to a few goals that didn't make the top 4. There's Dennis Bergkamp for giving us a preview of future goals he'll score against Leicester and Argentina, scored against Spurs. David Batty and Matt Letizia, who contribute to a season of great lobs. Juninho's magic at Old Trafford as he attempts to pull Borough out of the mire. And Gianfranco Zola and Chris Waddle for some pretty special free kicks. But in the end, here are the 4 goals that I think are the goal of the season contenders. Is it David Beckham against Wimbledon? A goal you can hear the iconic match of the day commentary of John Motson on if you lived through it, as the future England captain catches Neil Sullivan off his line from inside his own half. He raises 2 arms aloft like he's just done it in training, and a star is truly born. Sullivan is actually lobbed again a few days later at St James's Park by David Batty, this time from just the 35 yards. Or is it Philippe Albert, this time for number 5 in a famous win over Manchester United? For one of the greatest goalies of all time, Peter Schmeichel did seem to get caught off his line alarmingly often. Or is it Eric Cantona versus Sunderland? Nobody knows it yet, but we're witnessing the last hurrah of one of Old Trafford's most famous sons and a truly iconic player in the early Premier League years. One of his final goals at Old Trafford is perhaps his most famous, with a turn and run on the halfway line, a 1-2 with Brian McClare, and beats Lionel Perez in the Sunderland goal. Collar up, he stands and absorbs the adoration of all who witnessed it. Or is it Paulo Wanchope versus Manchester United? The Costa Rican debutant picks the ball up inside his own half and runs at the Manchester United backline, holding off Phil Neville, dancing past Gary Pallister and placing the ball beyond the reach of an advancing Schmeichel before running away, arms aloft, to the deafening silence of the Old Trafford home support and the jubilant cheers of the Derby fans in the away end. So, lads, they're the 4 that I've shortlisted. Which is your favourite? Or perhaps tell me why I'm wrong if your favourite hasn't been shortlisted. Damien, let's start with you.
My goal of the season actually needs to go to Andy Myers for Chelsea, who had no right scoring in this season. Against Sheffield Wednesday, he scored. There's a video of Andy Myers on YouTube entitled Andy Myers, Both Chelsea Goals. His other one was in his full debut in 91-92. And no right to be scoring and be there, right? Like we have Frank Sinclair scoring for us. Andy Myers definitely should have done it. But like what those players that it's like a unicorn, like you just never see it. And so for me, in blue, I would definitely put Andy Myers in there. But yeah, otherwise, if we're picking from the list, it's got to be Paulo Wanchope. Just an incredible run, great celebration. None of this fanning around, doing a salute or a Cristiano Ronaldo type stuff. Just mad, like absolutely lost it. He can't believe he's done it. We can't believe he's done it. Schmeichel can't believe he's done it. Absolutely what football is about. Just a spark of individual genius.
Ashley Ward confirmed that his teammates couldn't believe he'd done it either. Rob, what's your choice?
So my choice is Juninho versus Chelsea in a 1-0 win at the Riverside, in a brilliant goal that kind of sums up how good he was playing at that point in the season. He gets the ball off Emerson, dribbles past a few people, lays it off to Mikael Beck, who flicks the ball into the box, and he scores a little diving header. I think it's between Karin's tracksuited legs, which is always a great sight to see. And it's a brilliant goal, but I think that's a great goal. But I think for this season, the moments in those 4 goals that you've picked, I feel like there's more stories. Maybe it's just a memories thing, I don't know. But I feel like now the game's so different technically that a lot of the goals, you look at the more technical ability, but Beckham's goal launches his whole career. He was a great player at that point, really, had a lot of potential, but that basically started his career. Albert is one of the most iconic moments in Premier League history ever. Cantona, obviously, with this being his last season at United, you've got that So he's got that iconic moment forever where he just turns and sort of looks at, he's made that stadium. He's made that team, and that's kind of the moment where it kind of finishes. I feel like on the commentary of the one-shot one, I was watching it earlier, I'm sure the commentator says something like, they didn't even know he was going to be able to sort of play at this level because he'd never played at this sort of standard of football before. And to do it at Old Trafford against such a great team is great. I mean, I'd pick the Beckham one. I think just because it's such an iconic moment. Everybody's seen. Do you ever get the feeling, right, you're still checking that it was in his own half? When the ball rolls and you see him go behind it, you think, was he in his own? Because he just about hits it. Because, is it as good if it's in their half? Nah. But, it's just a great thing. And those Wimbledon nets as well at Selhurst Park, they were like hockey nets. How, like, the stanchion was almost, like, straight at the top. And it just made the goal look even better as it rolled down. And, Neil Sullivan scampering back to try and stop it. I think for me, that's iconic.
Rob, I think you've touched on something really beautiful that we don't maybe talk enough about in football is the gap between I've hit it and it's going in, right? There are some goals that you don't, like Tony Yeboah, like you don't see it, right? It just goes in and you love that it smacks off the woodwork. But that David Beckham one hangs for like Michael Jordan hang time, right? It's just up there and you're like, it can't. And all that possibility and all that fear and all that hope goes into that, 4.5 seconds or whatever it was. And we don't spend enough time maybe looking at that bubble. And that's what he's created. He's basically put a glass dome on top of that goal. Then we'll just forever be living in that 4.5 seconds.
So, in this final section, we've all become accustomed to football documentaries, but back in 1997, they were a little less common. That didn't stop Sunderland following in the footsteps of Peterborough United, Leyton Orient, and the England national team, though, as they invited the cameras of Premier Passions to follow them for their final season at Roker Park. I think they're all still on YouTube. They are incredible, although, spoiler alert, it doesn't end well. Rob, this is one of my favourite football documentaries of all time, and I remember watching it as a kid. How was it received in the North East when it was broadcast on the BBC the following season after Sunderland had been relegated?
I think it made us all laugh at Sunderland, really, because it was just kind of, it felt ridiculous. It's one of those things where, I mean, they've tried to outdo themselves with the Sunderland Till I Die documentary as well, to be fair. But I think the whole idea of this, what I love about this time was VHS, in the fact that they used to release all kinds of stuff. You had the standard season review stuff, then you'd have, it's getting towards Christmas and we're 8th in the table, so let's release a video of the last 4 months and that would come for Christmas. Then you'd have, somebody scored 50 goals, so let's release a video for that. Let's have 5 games from 4 decades ago. Yeah, that's great, because we found it in the old BBC film rooms. Let's whack it on a video. It was kind of like that's how they were pitching these shows to people who probably didn't understand the power of football at that point. I always remember not being allowed to watch it because of, obviously, Peter Reid's slightly industrial language, shall we say, during the programme. So I always remember going to school and have you seen that? Have you seen the documentary about Sunderland? No, what's it like? And then they would retell what it was. I was like, Dad, I've heard there's a documentary about Sunderland. No, all right. And it was kind of, obviously, years later you do watch it, but I think it's great when you see behind the scenes of what it's actually like. I do think it's quite funny that nobody actually would have gone into the dressing room beforehand and thought, shall we just do a little 30-minute demo and just see how it goes, and then we'll decide if we commit to the project or not. They've just gone, yeah, let's get it. Let's get the cameras in, get them in. We are a terrible team. We've got no good players. What could possibly go wrong? And, obviously, it's a great sort of testament to 90s football. And none of these 90s documentaries went well. None of them went well. There's some great stuff, but none of them end up being a positive experience for anybody involved.
And all the better for it for us watching at home. I mean, as you referenced there, Rob, Peter Reid is undoubtedly the star of the show. He did cause a bit of a stir at the time, though. Despite the programme going out at 10:45, Reid's use of the F word 40 times in the opening episode made tabloid headlines, beating Graham Taylor's 36 in The Impossible Job. Margaret Morrissey, spokeswoman for the National Confederation of Teachers, said at the time, it's outrageous that so many young people will see this programme. I was one of them and loved it. While a spokesman for the Professional Association for Teachers called for parents to use their common sense and not allow children to watch the programme. Damien, simple question. What's their fucking problem?
Well, exactly. It's a great point. I mean, I didn't, until I was in my 20s, realise there was a sex scene in Terminator. Because when my parents taped it off the telly, they just paused it. So there was like a kiss, and then all of a sudden some kind of action. Not that kind of action. And I think with something like this, really hard to edit to use your parental editing, like to skirt around it or to explain it once or twice, or maybe try to do like a cough over it. You'd give yourself some kind of hernia, wouldn't you, if you were trying to do that over Peter Reid? I don't mind. I really like swearing on telly, but I don't. As a comedian, I don't know about you, Carl, but I use it really like just to punctuate rather than that kind of industrial language. So I maybe I come at it slightly differently, but yeah, I don't fucking mind it.
Peter Reid went on to manage the Thai national side, winning his first game in charge against North Korea. He openly admitted to referring to players by their shirt numbers rather than names. Unless there's been a phoenix from the ashes return in between us recording this and whenever you're listening to it at home, his last managerial role was at Mumbai City. In between those jaunts to Asia, he has also had a season at Plymouth. It reads like an off-the-wall save on Football Manager, but fair play to him, he's done all right. So wrapping up the 96-97 season, PFA Player of the Year is Alan Shearer. David Beckham is Young Player of the Year, and Gianfranco Zola wins the Football Writers Player of the Year, despite joining 2 months into the season. Such is the Italians' impact. Juninho wins Premier League Player of the Season. The PFA Team of the Year is David Seaman for Arsenal, Gary Neville for Manchester United, Tony Adams for Arsenal, Mark Wright for Liverpool, and Stig Bjornaby for Liverpool. David Beckham, Roy Keane, both for Manchester United, David Batty for Newcastle, Steve McManaman of Liverpool, and up front it's Ian Wright for Arsenal and Alan Shearer for Newcastle. It's Alan Shearer's 6th consecutive season voted into the PFA Team of the Year. I mean, any surprises there for either of you? I suppose Ian Wright, it's a classic great in-between season, kind of, he's always consistent, but this is after Euro 96. It's before France 98, neither of which are tournaments he'll go to. He kind of has this quite stellar season in between. But other than that, any surprises in there?
Mark Wright and Stig Bjornaby. I watched them in my first game on that season ticket, and I wouldn't have thought they'd fit anywhere into a team of the season, to be honest.
Fair enough. And perhaps I'm unlucky. No Chelsea players in there as well. After perhaps Zola would have deserved a spot if there'd have been a third striker.
Yeah, well, he got a Football Writers Association Footballer of the Year. Part of me always thinks individual accolades as a footballer, Harry Kane, and don't really mean anything because actually you're there for teamwork and silverware. But I think he got that because he was world class, right? You don't need to elbow your way out of between, two. I mean, there's a lot of English. I've looked over the last few years that follow this. There's a lot of English on the list, right? It is massively racist. They definitely should be shaking it up more. But again, the guys that are picking it have been around for a long time, and the game has changed. There's a David and a Gary and a Tony and a Mark and a Steve and an Ian and an Alan, and these are all names that have largely died out from society now. So it was kind of behind the times already. But yeah, no, I would have liked to have seen the Team of the Year based on the cars that they drove when they were signed that season. Because when you look at Ole Gunnar Solskjaer driving out of Old Trafford for the first time, he's in like a red Metro or a Vauxhall Nova, and he looks really happy about it. And it's like, I've got a car. I've never had a car before. I absolutely love it because, again, it's just a complete world away from where we are now.
So 96-97 is complete, with Manchester United winning their 4th title in 5 years with 75 points, which remains the lowest total since the switch to 3 points for a win in 81-82 to this day. Newcastle finished runners-up to book a return to the Champions League by virtue of better goal difference over Arsenal and Liverpool. That 7-1 win over Spurs probably helped secure that spot. Also being the joint biggest win of the season, shared with Everton's 7-1 win over Southampton. Aston Villa and Chelsea complete the top 6. Newly promoted sides, Leicester and Derby, survive comfortably in 9th and 12th respectively, but Sunderland make an immediate return to the First Division. At least nobody commissioned a documentary about their season. Coventry City survive at the expense of Middlesbrough, whose controversial 3-point deduction is the difference between 14th and 19th place in a congested bottom third of the table. Nottingham Forest's 3-season stay is over as they finish bottom. Southampton, Everton, West Ham and Blackburn all finish within just 3 points of the trap door. 8th place Wimbledon play in the most and least attended Premiership games of the season, with fewer than 8,000 at their home game against Leeds in April and more than 55,000 present for their January visit to Old Trafford. They also reached the semi-finals of both domestic cup competitions in a season where they spent almost 6 months inside the top 6. The FA Cup goes to Chelsea, with Roberto Di Matteo's wallop in the opening minute, seeing silverware return to Stamford Bridge for the first time in over a quarter of a century. They defeat Middlesbrough, who also fall in the League Cup final replay to newly promoted Leicester City. Congratulations and commiserations to both of my guests. In Europe, Dortmund dispatched Manchester United in the semi-finals before a 3-1 win against perennial finalist Juventus, season them lift the Champions League. Barcelona beat PSG 1-0 in the Cup Winners' Cup final, with a Ronaldo penalty enough to win the trophy. Schalke defeat Inter Milan on penalties to lift the UEFA Cup. Schalke, by the way, needed extra time in the previous round as well, after a 1-0 first leg defeat in Tenerife, of all teams. Tenerife reaching the UEFA Cup quarterfinals. That match was refereed by David Ellery, who was presumably still recovering from the all-inclusive when he took charge of Chesterfield versus Middlesbrough the following weekend. But don't worry, Rob, I'm over it as a hometown Chesterfield boy over 26 years later. Some of the big stories during this season: Tony Blair becomes British Prime Minister. Bill Clinton is sworn in for an uneventful second term as American president. The Nintendo 64 and DVD format are both released in North America. And Katrina and the Waves wins the Eurovision Song Contest for the UK. Can either of you remember the song? Katrina and the Waves.
Love Shine a Light.
Love Shine a Light.
Love Shine a Light. There you go. Both on it. Both on
Yeah.
it. Very good. At the cinema, the top grossing movie of 1996 was Independence Day, in a varied top 10 that included Seven, Babe, Toy Story, Trainspotting, and Jumanji. Quite a trip to the cinema that would have been. Tom Cruise stars in the first Mission Impossible. I'm sure that's the last we'll be hearing about that franchise. The Spice Girls had 3 of the 1996's top-selling singles, with Wannabe, Say You'll Be There, and Two Become One in 2nd, 4th, and 5th place, respectively. Three Lions was the 7th best-selling single of the year. Peter Andre's Mysterious Girl was 9th, and Don't Look Back in Anger was 10th. All were outsold by the Fugees, with Killing Me Softly being 1996's bestseller. Spaceman, Return of the Mac, Ooh Ah Just a Little Bit, and Children by Robert Miles complete the top 10. And that brings to a close the 1996-97 season. So, gentlemen, before we let you go, we have a game that we play on this show. And this is Rob's debut in this game as well, because it does require 2 guests. We're going to play Your Apps Right. Basically, I'm going to give you a series of Premier League players from the past. And you're going to tell me if the player that you hear has made more or fewer appearances than the player that precedes him. This is Premier League appearances only, according to PremierLeague.com, so it doesn't include any First Division appearances pre-1992. All will become clear, and you will notice there is a theme with these players. They do all have a connection one way or another to 96-97. Damien, I'm going to come to you first. Your first player, or the first player in the game, that you're going to have to guess the number of Premier League appearances for, is PFA left back of the year, Stig Inge Bjorneby. How many Premier League appearances do you think Stig Inge Bjorneby made?
72.
72. Rob, what would your guess be?
183.
Okie doke. So, Rob, you are closest. It's 162, actually, for Liverpool and Blackburn. He only scored twice in that time, both coming this season. So, Rob, you start with control of the board. There are 11 players to get through. We've had our first one. Do you want to take control and go from here, or do you want to see if Damien can pave a pathway through for you?
No, I'll go first.
Okay, Rob, you're going to go first. Stig Inge Bjorneby, 162 Premier League appearances. Is our next player higher or lower? Neil Cox.
Lower.
Lower is correct. 143 appearances for Villa, Middlesbrough, Bolton and Watford. Is our next player higher or lower than Neil Cox's 143? Kevin Pressman.
Higher.
Higher is correct. 207 appearances, all for Sheffield Wednesday. He would also have spells at Leeds and Leicester without making any top-flight appearances for them. Our next player is Marcus Gale. Higher or lower than Kevin Pressman's 207?
Lower.
Lower, just 204 appearances. He scored 34 times in that period. He also made 18 appearances for Jamaica. You're paving away here, Rob. So Marcus Gale's 204. Our next Premier League player is Alf Inge Haaland. Higher or lower than 204?
Higher.
You're saying higher, Rob. Alf Inge Haaland is lower, 181 appearances for Nottingham Forest, Leeds and Manchester United, which means for the first time, almost halfway through the board, we switch to you, Damien. Alf Inge Haaland is your player with 181. Is our next player higher or lower? Reggie Blinker.
Lower.
Lower is correct. Quite significantly lower, actually. 43 appearances for Sheffield Wednesday across 2 seasons. He would go on to become a cult hero north of the border at Celtic. After Reggie Blinker's 43, our next player is Ail Berkovic. Higher or lower?
Higher.
Higher, 146 appearances and 17 goals for Southampton, West Ham, Man City and Portsmouth. Graham Souness did claim to have signed him on a similar trial spell to the one he brought Ali Dia in, so maybe it was worth the risk after all. Ail Berkovic is 146. Our next player is Julian Dix.
You had to name the one player whose name I just cannot ever speak. I just... he once stamped on John Spencer in a Premier League game, and that was enough for me to feel very poor things about anyone called Julian or with the surname Dix. So, but I'm going to say higher. I've just got a feeling.
You're saying higher than Ail Berkovic's 146. It's actually just slightly lower, 134 appearances.
Thank God I don't have to say that name again.
For Liverpool and West Ham. He scored 24 times, most of those penalties absolutely wellied down the middle, which means we switch back to you, Rob. You are 3 from the end. Julian Dix is 134. Our next player, Georgios Donis.
Lower.
Lower is correct. 21 appearances with 2 goals and 2 assists. The Greek, Alan Shearer, he was not. Next up, Karol Poborski, higher or lower than Georgios Donis's 21 appearances? Karol Poborski.
Higher.
Higher is correct. 32 appearances and 5 goals for Manchester United across 2 seasons. He was capped over 100 times for the Czech Republic, and that sensational goal against Portugal was actually his first goal for his national side. That means, Damien, that at this moment, all you can do now is sit and watch. Rob has the deciding shot here. If Rob gets this correct, he wins. If he misses, you are our winner, Damien, for the prize of precisely nothing. So, Rob, it's over to you. Karol Poborski's 32 appearances. Our final player, is he higher or lower? Jordi Cruyff.
Good one. Lower.
You're saying lower. Jordi Cruyff lower than Karol Poborski's 32. Out of interest, Damien, what might you have gone for?
I would have gone for the same. Because I think he had fleeting appearances for United, and he wasn't a mainstay. So I would have gone with that. So let's share it.
Okay. If it is lower, Rob, you win. Damien, if it's higher, you're our winner. Jordi Cruyff is higher, 34 appearances and 8 goals across 4 seasons and a title in 96, 97. He was actually somehow still on the books for the treble season, which means, Damien, you are our winner. So well played.
Thanks. I really wanted Rob to win. I really think Chelsea have screwed Middlesbrough over enough times in competition. It would have been only fair to be the screwy rather than the screwer. But well played, Rob. That was a great game.
At least it wasn't lost on Roberto Di Matteo. Gentlemen, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Damien, let's start with you. Where can people find you online? What have you got coming up?
So I'm currently producing season 5 of award-nominated wrestling comedy podcast Wrestling with the Champ. We are freshly back from our second run at the Edinburgh Festival. Our first episode in the new series, if you like Doctor Who and wrestling, it's a crossover, which is my sort of secret audition to be a writer on the Big Finish Productions, I suppose. But yeah, there's that really. It's a good place to do it. And if you like kids' books, I've written a couple of kids' books, one for each of my 2 children, so they're out there as well. If you find me on Twitter at Damien St John, I can send you a link. Might not be able to give you a discount code. Stop being tight. Just pay the money.
Fantastic. Thank you, Damien. And Rob, we've got an entire episode devoted to your fantastic book. I believe there is a second book in the offing. So tell us about both of those.
Yeah, that's right. So 1992, The Birth of Modern Football is available from all bookshops, mainly online ones, because there aren't any real bookshops left. My next book is called Chaos, Controversy and That Kung Fu Kick, which is about the 94-95 season. So that's at 94-95_book. I also run an online, previously a print magazine about Middlesbrough, and that's at borough_mag. And we are on Substack doing a couple of articles a week, a podcast a week, because print costs so much money, we can't do that anymore. So we're all online now, and it's all free. So if you're a Borough fan or not, give us a follow.
Fantastic. And just as well, I mean, clearly, if you've got to this point of this podcast, it goes without saying you are going to really enjoy Rob's first book, and I'm certain his soon-to-be released second book as well. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and see you both soon. We'll have you both back on, I'm sure, very soon in the future.
Enthusiastic nods. Thank you. I didn't want to talk over anyone. Oh, I did it. Oh.
So that was Rob and Damien, a very enjoyable chat there. 96-97 was a hugely significant season for me. It was definitely the season I discovered I was completely obsessed with football, post Euro 96 and post completing a sticker album in 95-96 at primary school. 96-97 really was the first season where I just felt like I didn't miss a game. So if you feel the same way about that season, I hope we did it justice for you. But what a season of football it was. And 97-98 has been recorded very recently as well. I'll have that for you in a few weeks' time. Another really, really good season. So hope you enjoyed that, and I certainly did. You heard what the lads think about the greatest player from Burkina Faso. If you agree, you can go and vote now in the week after the show has been released on Twitter/X on a poll that will be on there for a little while. I'll reveal the results next week. Not quite as stellar a lineup. Maybe Bertrand Traoré is going to be the favourite, but who knows what our other two players will go on and achieve in their careers. So that will be on social media. So do find the When Football Began Again social media platforms for more details on that. As ever, if you'd like to support the show, you can do that just by giving it a share, giving it a review. I really appreciate that. Every single person that does that really helps other people find it. So thank you if that's something that you're helping me out with. You can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/whenfootballbeganagain and just make a small donation towards the show if you feel so inclined. But I just want you to enjoy the show and share it with other like-minded fans. That is my goal with this. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's show. Next week's show, we keep one foot firmly in 1996-97. I have Tom Flight, the author of You're Joking, Aren't You? The story of Middlesbrough's 96-97 season. It's a great book. We kind of go through that and the kind of ups and downs of Middlesbrough season. In between, we pick some deserted island matches that he would take with him with a bit of a Middlesbrough theme as well. So 96-97, very much the theme of next week's episode as well. So if you did enjoy today, do come back for that. In the meantime, though, that's it for this week. Don't forget, I've still got Clive Tildesley to end this series this side of Christmas. Really can't wait to release those episodes. Lots more fantastic guests coming up. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate you. And I will see you next week for Tom Flight. See you then.